Okay, as I was saying, what I want to do today is to convince you of the importance of American painting as an archive, as yet untapped, unexamined, of the history of sexuality. And we can see that immediately here in Thomas Eakins' Great Swimming from 1885, a painting that I should note actually antedates the first use of the word homosexual in English. That word was first used in 1889. So it immediately raises a number of interesting questions. How do you talk about sexuality in advance of the very category that we use today traditionally to describe it? Now, of course, I'm not saying that there weren't homosexual activities, but the idea of a being, of an identity as homosexual was, at least at this point, still in the development. And we can see that in Eakins' painting, we can't use the terminology that we would want to use. I should note, however, that we put particular pressure on questions of sexuality to be historically specific in a way that we don't put pressure on other words. For example, we readily use the term marriage to describe relationships that are vastly different historically in their social organization, but when someone tries to use a term related to sexuality, you say, no, you have to be historically specific here. So I'm being historically specific. And what I'm going to say here is that, above all, Eakins is a sexual dissident. What we know about Eakins in every regard is that he pushed the boundaries of what was considered normative or acceptable regarding sexuality. And we can see that even here where, I can't pose with my students nude, right? But he's doing that. And moreover, this is Eakins right here. He's clearly watching. And what's striking about this, and this is the painting I really want to pay attention to, is his salutat. It's a familiar prototype. We've seen lots of images of an erotic figure bathed in white light in the center of a crowd, but that figure is always female. In salutat, we have the figure of a male. Not only a male, but it is, I think it's fair to say, the queerest boxing picture ever made. Queer precisely because the point of a boxing picture is blood and gluts and masculine glory. There's no boxing going on. He is a featherweight fighter, the lowest rank. He's 22 years old. We know everything about Eakins, so his name is Billy Smith, and he goes by the fighting name of Turkey Point Billy Smith, not the most masculine of monikers. And Turkey Point Billy Smith is shown here, right, in a way that actually entraps us in a homoerotic gaze. Because if you look carefully, you'll see that everybody is looking at Billy, right? And we complete that circuit. So whether we want to be part of a homoerotic gaze or not, we are necessarily staring at Billy's butt. And that kind of resistance to social norms is classically Eakins. Remember, this is the man who, fed up with the doubled standard that allowed men to look at women but did not allow women to look at men, tore the loincloth off a model and was promptly fired from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But we can also see it in the work of somebody like John Singer Sargent, who uses the traditional art historical category that all of us were taught in beginning art history, the odalisque, but here, of course, in a masculine, right, guise. And what's interesting here is that the point of an odalisque, the raised arms, the slightly spread legs, is to offer a heterosexual invitation, right, to reveal the breast, to show the possibility of, right, penetration. But here, right, redone for a man. And this is his manservant, Nicola d'Inverna, who posed for a number of images just like this. But it's this picture that I think is really our Rosetta Stone that will allow us to unpack some of the complexity of the historical construction of sexuality, precisely because, the arrogance of the present is that we think that the past construction of sexuality is relatively similar to our own. But in fact, in a picture like this, we can begin to get a sense of a very different worldview. This is, of course, a bathhouse, not that kind of bathhouse, rather from a period right before indoor plumbing when people went regularly to the baths. And you would, of course, in the context of sex-segregated environments, see homoerotic interactions. Bellows is a really interesting figure precisely because he's, number one, right, he is the most famous artist of his period, younger artist of his period. He is also producing this not as a painting, which would go to one interested, right, observer, but he's making it as a print, and not just as a print. It was a print that was so popular, it went through 3 different states and it sold out. So what we're looking at is a print of one of his most popular prints, and it is a queer subject for a popular print, is it not? I don't know if there'd be many dealers today who would show a work like this, because what we're looking at is clearly a homoerotic interaction front and center in the image. And we know sort of who's who here. Clearly, right, we can pick out, using the language of the time, the queer. He's got all the concatenation of stereotypes that are still living with us today. He's got, right, the thrust out buttocks, he's got the hands on the hips, he's got the leer, he's even got the damn mustache. So in every respect, right, he's the queer. But given the structure of sexuality at this time, we come to understand there's actually a very different worldview at work. Because the other man has a face that's a mask of impassivity. He's a muscular, heavy-set man. And at first you would say, what's the interaction between them? But if you look closely, you'll detect that mound of maleness has, shall we say, a heavily starched towel. And so what we're looking at is a homoerotic interaction between, in the language of the time, right, queer and trade, in which queerness is not the sex, the gender of the individual with whom you have intercourse, but your own sex, in the language of the time, in the sexual act. So if you acted as a man in sex, you were a man and it didn't really matter what you penetrated. But if you were indeed as a man penetrated, you were a queer. And there's a complex taxonomy of all the different positions at this time. We know this very clearly in the historical literature. But this is a queer trade relationship that underscores, right, what you would have seen had you been in a bathhouse in the early 20th century. And George Bellows was a member of the Ashcan school. He was interested in the social margins. He was interested in people of color, of immigrants, of lower classes. He was interested, in short, for a complex picture of American life, which included remarkably queers. And so we have this remarkable image in which, right, sexuality is folded into the history of American art in a way that rather remarkably we rarely encounter today. And the implications of this are profound, because the idea that queer and trade needed each other, that what would be a straight identified man and a gay identified man could have sexual relationships, has profound ripple effects. Most centrally, the idea that one does not any longer have the need for or desire in the development of a ghettoized community. You know, we would say, well, what was the matter with those early 20th century people? Why didn't they create the gay bars? Why didn't they create the gay neighborhoods, the newspapers, the whole apparatus of sexuality that led to contemporary liberation? Were they so primitive? But in fact, right, at that historical moment, gay and straight, by definition, needed each other. In fact, you couldn't be gay, right, without the straight man to penetrate you. What were you going to do with another gay guy? So, as a consequence, the communities were connected. And I'm going to be arguing that actually in the early 20th century, there's a much greater evidence of connection between queer and straight than there would be after the development of the term gay and the beginning of modern gay and lesbian liberation. We can see that here in another picture, huge presentation picture by Bellows. This is nearly 8 feet long, nearly 6 feet high. So it's a gigantic picture intended, right, as a public statement. And in it, Everybody belongs. It's a scene, right, of the social margins, working class people dropping their kids off or picking them up as part of an urban swimming hole. Everybody is there in a motivated way. The boys are skinny dipping. The mothers are either picking them up or dropping them off. But there's one figure who clearly doesn't belong. Do you see him? There he is, right? Wearing a top hat, wearing tails, having a glove. He's a classic dandy. And he's there just to watch. Evidence of the fact that, right, erotic possibilities in urban America were not overlooked by the Ashcan school. We can really see the particular taxonomy of desire in this remarkable image called On That Street by Charles Demuth. On That Street referenced a particular street in Brooklyn near the New York Naval Yards, the Brooklyn Naval Yards, a street that was famous for its ability to provide, in the language of the time, seafood. Sailors who were available for a certain amount of money or a bed and a warm meal. And here you see on that street a pickup scene going on. That's Demuth. We always know it's Demuth because he had a bad leg and he's always in a kind of slightly contrapposto posture when he presents himself. He's wearing the brown coat. And he's looking at another man who's clearly, right, the queer. On the left, he's even got his hand on his hip, just like we've seen. And then there's another guy who's the trade, right? This guy here. And Demuth is staring at the queer going, essentially, why are you horning in on my game here? Right? The point is that I'm the rich guy and I can give him, right, what he wants. What can you offer? But you sense, right, in this interaction, Demuth's recognition that the codes of the period are being violated. And you can see here the Demuth's recognition of a kind of banquet of sexuality and its frustrations. Because in Distinguished Air, right, you have, again, the Demuth stand-in with the cane, you see him there, holding, right, a woman, but staring at the butt of a sailor. Then you see, right, the sailor staring at the bosom of a woman. The woman covering her genitals with a fan in horror, looking at the Brancusi-like sculpture. And nobody seems to get what they want, yet sexuality is animating the entire scene. This is Demuth's attempt to forge an iconography that discusses questions of sexuality. This is Calla Lilies, and you'll notice the subtitle is Bert Savoy. Bert Savoy was the most famous female impersonator of his time. His shows were regularly reviewed in the New York Herald. So we're looking at a major theatrical figure whose performance only as women, right, was always ended with a signature move. Someone would come on stage with a huge bunch of calla lilies and present it to Bert. Calla lilies being, of course, that curiously male and female flower, and thus his personal symbol. And here we have, right, coming out of a shell, a traditionally, right, female attribute, those calla lilies representing Bert. Here we see the beginning, and fully self-conscious beginning, of an iconography of lesbianism. And remember, this is a moment, again, where there are no codes. How do you represent? And so what we have is Berenice Abbas in a remarkable narrow period in her life, basically between 1924 and 1928, when she was taking photographs in France of expatriate lesbian American community. She would return to New York, become the great poet, photographer of New York streets, and deny that she had ever had any lesbian relationships or was interested in lesbian life. Nonetheless, we have the pictures as evidence. And this is Janet Flanner, a very famous writer at the period for the New Yorker magazine and known for her mannishness And of course, what we have not only is the masculine posture with the hand, right, thoughtfully placed as a kind of intellectual along the cheek, but much more strikingly, the moving of those masks to the top of the top hat, off the face. In advance, let's be clear, of the metaphor of coming out. So this is, to take the mask off is clearly, right, she is thinking through as a metaphor. Romaine Brooks had nothing to fear as a figure. She inherits the largest fortune an American woman had ever inherited up at that point, and becomes entirely self-sustaining. She has no need for galleries or commissions or sales, and so she's free to paint exactly as she wants. And what she wants to do in this self-portrait is to show herself mannishly. She doesn't want to be male. We're very clear that this is not male drag, but it is masculine, right, female drag at a moment when that is beginning, especially as the 20s move on, to catch a certain, right, wave and become increasingly popular. And you see her riding gloves. And if you read her letters, you'll see a certain degree of puzzlement at the idea that working class women could be lesbian, precisely because she understands her sexuality as class linked. She has the possibility of inhabiting a traditionally masculine social role because she has the wherewithal financially to claim it. Other women don't. One working class scholar remarked in her biography of Romaine Brooks that reading the letters, I was sweaty with working class need. Here's Cecil Beaton also trying to think through what a lesbian iconography would look like. And remarkably, right, with the social construct that we visit upon female-female relationships, he felt the need to separate these women in order to suggest their closeness. Right, because women can touch each other. Women can be friends, they can be family. There's much less of a social, right, stigma on physical contact as there might be with men. And so paradoxically, he separates, right, the two, putting Gertrude in front, of course, and Alice behind, and then remarkably lets an electric wire, right, electrify the space between them as if to suggest their intimacy. An extraordinary portrait. But it's this picture that really helps us understand what's going on in, I would argue, a parallel America. This is an advertisement by the great blues artist Ma Rainey for her song Prove It On Me Blues in 1928. Now, we talk about the Harlem Renaissance as if all of a sudden something interesting happened in Harlem that was artistically fertile. But of course, I would argue that things were always interesting in Harlem. What had changed around this period was actually Prohibition. And what Prohibition did was bring white people in search of liquor and entertainment into African-American neighborhoods, precisely because in a very familiar American model, if you want to get illicit substances, you have to go to economically and racially marginalized neighborhoods to do so, right? The police will keep it out of white neighborhoods. They care a little bit less in other neighborhoods, right? And so white people went to Harlem for the first time, and when they got to Harlem, they found a culture that was completely different regarding sexuality. They found, for example, buffet flats, institutionalized sexual banquets, which the term buffet flat underscores is premised on taste. So in one room, you'd see a man and a woman. In another room, you'd see a man and a man. In a third room, you'd see a woman and a woman. And if you paid a little more, you could potentially even participate. And the idea here was that these were not different types of people. You didn't have, right, one gay buffet flat and a straight buffet flat. Buffets suggest that everybody's the same, we just differ a little bit in our tastes. And that idea was animating this too. Because Ma Rainey in 1925 was famously hosting a, not to put too fine a point on it, a lesbian orgy in her apartment. And they made a lot of noise, and the neighbors complained, and the police came. And the police closed her down, and Ma Rainey, who was not a small woman, tried to run down the fire escape, and she fell. She got busted. All the other women escaped. Everybody in Harlem knew about this. Ma Rainey was already a major blues figure at this point. And so what does she do? In 1928, she records this album called Prove It On Me Blues. The refrain for the song is, they say I do it, ain't nobody caught me, y'all gotta prove it on me. Right? Then she goes through the chorus in which she says things like, yeah, it's true I don't wear a collar. I like a tie. Yeah, it's true I don't like men. Yeah, it's true. And she goes through a whole series of social stereotypes of lesbianism. She says, yeah, it's all true. It's all true. But y'all got to prove it on me. Remember, they caught her at the bottom of the stairs, not in the apartment. Right? So Madonna-like, she's using her sexual dissidence to sell records, and it worked. In 1928, the #1 race record in America, Prove It On Me Blues. And you can even see it in the advertisement if you pay attention. There's a cop, right? He's staring at a large woman dressed mannishly, that's Ma Rainey, who's chatting up two svelte, younger African-American women. Do you see it? So she's even using, right, the visuals to promote this incident as well as the song itself. I was taught in the Dark Ages that Marsden Hartley was the first artist to do abstract art in America because he was in Germany, and Germany was close to Paris. And this is, of course, 1914-15 when Picasso's at work. And so, by osmosis, he picked up all of this. What I wasn't told was what we now know, which was that Marsden Hartley was in love with a German officer by the name of Karl von Freiberg, and Karl von Freiberg was killed in the opening battles of the First World War, posing a major problem emotionally for somebody like Marsden Hartley. How do you mourn a dead beloved who's not only a man, but an enemy combatant? And moreover, right, what Marsden Hartley decides to do is to use all the symbols he can to address that man. So you see the KVF, Karl von Freiberg. You can tell me how old he was when he died. You can tell that he was a member of the cavalry, the last major war fought with cavalry. There's his spurs. He was in the Eisenbahn in the 4th unit. He won a German heart after he was killed. There's his German military helmet. Those are Hartley's personal symbols for immortality, the entire form of the image, assuming the Catholic construction of the Assumption into heaven, right? A classic Renaissance and earlier move, and he's even got a halo on the top of the man's head. Now, I said that art historians didn't recognize this, but clearly other artists did, because in 1942, this man, George Platt Lynes, one of the great photographers in America, a man who at the age of 18 was a member of Gertrude Stahl's Salon, by the age of 20 had opened a bookstore, by the age of 26 was editor of American Vogue. And I should say, at the age of 55, dying of cancer, he checks himself out of the hospital, goes home and burns his archives, destroying over 4,000 images. Precisely because what he was photographing at that moment was literally illegal. He was worried about what would happen to the subjects of his photography. But in this image, he poses Marsden Hartley near the end of Marsden's life. Marsden would only live 3 more months. And he invites him into the studio after receiving horrific news, because George Platt Lynes, the photographer, was in love with a young man by the name of Jonathan Titchener. And Jonathan dies in the dawning days of the Second World War. So he goes to Jonathan's brother, George, and he asks him to pose, dressed in Jonathan's military uniform. That's the young man in the back. So wearing his beloved's military uniform, he poses him next to a sad-looking Marsden Hartley, who, right, is lit so as to suggest a halo around his head. Connecting, right, love and loss across 2 world wars in a pictorial way that could be realized in no other fashion. Now, this is what we know familiarly, would have known familiarly, of Georgia O'Keeffe in 1919, which is to say Stieglitz's photographs of her body. And it posed a problem for an ambitious young female artist, as you can see very clearly here, where she takes Stieglitz's photograph and paints over it and rather aggressively scrawls O'Keeffe right over her breasts as if to reclaim them. But early on, O'Keeffe's imagery was continuously freighted with masculinist assumptions. So in this picture, when it was discussed and written about critically, people talked about the fact that here we have Stieglitz's own words, finely woman on paper, and she is passive, awaiting fulfillment by a man. Needless to say, this did not accord with O'Keeffe's own understandings. Clearly, the works are about sexuality, but she started to deny that they were about sexuality because, of course, their structure of sexuality was always of the woman as the passive recipient of male glory. And so what she does is quite remarkable. She turns to the desert. And she does these famous paintings. In 1926, 1931, when this painting was made, O'Keeffe had written a pamphlet describing her practice. It was actually published in 1926. It's called About Myself. And in it, she says that when I started to paint flowers, you took all your assumptions about flowers and you put them on my flowers as if I think about flowers as you think about flowers, and I do not. Very clearly stated, right? And then she says, so I went to the desert, and there I found the bones of the creatures living in the desert spoke to me as more alive than anything with flesh and tails switching. And so I turned to the bones of the desert. And that's all she said. But if we look very carefully, we will see that in some sense, what these images do is reproduce the format and structure of her flower paintings, giving us the opportunity to glimpse a form redolent of female sexuality that is not warm, soft, penetrable, and organic in the way that the flowers are. That is not inviting to the male, right? But is instead vagina dentata, quite literally. And repeatedly, if you pay attention to O'Keeffe's structuring of these bones, there are these vaginal clefts, right? There is a labial sense, even fallopian tubes in the horns. And again, this invocation of a female embodiment in a form that will deny an erotic male gaze. Here you even have, right, the flower below the skull as if to seal the case for their equivalency. And not only would she do this with skulls and flowers in the desert, but she would even do it with the desert itself. This is Black Place number 1. And if you take a look at the landscapes of O'Keeffe, you will often see that they have a similar, at least prospect of, right, a coded or analogic relationship to female embodiment. But it's this picture that I think really makes the case as clearly as possible. Because, of course, we know the social and cultural construct around a ram's horn or a goat's horn. It's the priapic model, right? We even in English use the term horny in reference to this. The idea that the goat horn is the symbol of male wild sexuality. And what does she do? She takes that horn and she turns it as a void, right? Not as an extension, but as a void. And if we don't get that, she paints it in red. And so, right, that masculine symbol turned feminine. Now, I'm not saying that she was lesbian identified. I'm also not saying that she didn't have lesbian affairs. We know that she did. What I'm saying is that, like so many queer artists, she had to find a formula, a code in which to address her desires in a way that took into consideration the dominant culture in which they'd be understood. And if you doubt that, then take a look at this picture. There's only one painting by O'Keeffe that was turned into a photograph. It is, what a surprise, or goat's horn with red, right? And in it, O'Keeffe, here in her mid-80s, quite frail and sick, positions herself at the center of the void. And we know from the records of this photographic session that she insisted, though she was frail, that she would stand there and pose. Paul Cadmus is what I believe is the beginning of a record of change. Something significant is happening here. Because up till now, I've been arguing about the connection between queer and straight culture at this moment. But with Paul Cadmus's painting, we begin to see the division of two communities. Quite literally, the painting is divided into two. I'm going to be arguing that that's the gay side, that's the straight side. And you'll notice that in the middle, right, a gigantic question mark out of the clouds. It's thematizing that divide. Because, of course, at this moment, the federal government is putting a lot of energy into homophobia. There's a great deal of Red Scare activity, such that we now call this period the Lavender Scare, because more queer people than even communists lost their position at this time. And in this environment, Paul Cadmus does something very strange. He goes back to a 1938 text by the British author E.M. Forster. And E.M. Forster, in 1938, smelling the forthcoming Second World War, writes a very worried essay in which he says, what's going to become of Western civilization? He can hear the jackboots in his mind. And he says, what's going to happen to the tradition of arts and culture? And he says, there's going to be an answer. And the answer is that there is a coalition of the sensitive, his word. And the coalition of the sensitive will keep Western culture alive during this horrific forthcoming war. And he says, well, how do you know the coalition of the sensitive? He says, well, you won't know them, but they know each other. They know each other when they catch each other's eye in the street. And the more he goes on, the more you come to realize that he's talking in code about queers. And he's arguing that queers are the ones who are going to keep culture alive during the Second World War. And that's what Paul Cadmus reaches back to 10 years right after the publication of that essay, 4 years after the end of the war, to talk about queer culture. And on this side, there we have Paul Cadmus drawing, the artist himself. Next to him, his lover, Jared French. Above him, this figure with the literary strap on him. That's nonetheless E.M. Forster himself. Next to him is Margaret French, Jared's wife, whom he met and married after, right, meeting and being involved with the artist Paul Cadmus. They continued as a kind of triumvirate and indeed produced work together, famous work together. The name Pajama standing for Paul, Jared, Margaret. They're each of their first names. And of course, you can see here Lincoln Kirstein, Paul Cadmus's brother-in-law, who's turned away because he was a bit of a closet case. And of course, all the arts, literature, painting, architecture, music. The grass is green, it's an Elysian field. Now look at the other side of the picture. Even the grass doesn't grow. It's all death and destruction. That's at the top, Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini raining down destruction. It's not a progressive vision. It's actually a very disturbing one from our sensibilities, because there are, right, as part of the horror of this moment, race mixing. Interestingly enough, you see, right, Asian, white, black, all together, including, interestingly enough, a Jew, as if that was also a separate race, a weird choice at the end of the First World War. Here you have a skull, and there, of course, you have the only positive image, the procreative couple, looking, of course, very Grecian, necessary for the continuation. But it's the queers who are keeping the arts alive. This notion of a divided world then begins to predominate. And we can see it most clearly here in Jess's remarkable 1951 work, The Mouse's Tale. Probably, I would argue, the first politically invested work of fine art in gay liberation. The Mouse's Tail is made out of small pieces cut out from posing strap magazines, hundreds and hundreds of them, including, I should say, a portrait of McCarthy and a self-portrait by Jess. And these individual posing figures conglomerate and make up, thank you, and make up a posing strap. And that figure is posed in a mirror. And that mirror is made out of clowns. You can see that very clearly. And the clowns, right, produce a line of heads that end in a noose. And in the noose, there is a small piece of concrete poetry. It is from, actually, Lewis Carroll's The Mouse's Tail. And it reads, "No need for a trial, no need for a jury. I'll be the judge. I'll try the case, and I'll sentence you to death." An exact quotation from The Mouse's Tail. And so, of course, what we have here is, right, an image that bespeaks how queers are reflected in this clown-like mirror that is unable to see them and sentences them to death. And then, right, in 1954, but 3 years after Jess's painting, Jasper Johns' famous flag painting. And I bring it in part because I want to begin to turn to the generation of Johns and Rauschenberg, Twombly, etc., because they are finding ways to encode resistance, not to speak it in direct language like Jess would have, even though his was slightly coded, but in very particular ways. This painting is implicated in what I really want to talk about, which is the picture that commemorates the end of their relationship. They were together roughly between 1954 and 1962. But it begins to fray in 1961. And it's this picture that commemorates the dissolution of the love between Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. It's a picture called In Memory of My Feelings, Frank O'Hara, and typically Johnsian. It's an act of ventriloquism. He's throwing his emotional voice through the work of the poet, the famous gay poet Frank O'Hara. And Frank O'Hara is, in this poem, In Memory of My Feelings, describing how you survive the end of a love affair. And what Frank O'Hara prescribes is actually quite remarkable. He says, we must grab the pistol and kill, right, the serpent at the scene of ourselves. A remarkable idea of selfhood, not as singular, but as a scene of ourselves, something that people who live in marginal identities know well, that you can't always be the same person. And in some respects, you're required to be one person at home, another person at church, another person in public, another person with colleagues, because they have, right, preconceived ideas of you. And in that image, in that poem, right, talking about the end of a love affair, Johns, like we saw earlier with the Cadmus, bifurcates the painting in two. You can see very clearly the hinges. It's a wonderful metaphor, right, of an altarpiece that closes in on itself. And I'm going to argue that this is the before side when they were a couple, and this is the after side after they broke up. In the before side, we see a fork and a spoon tied together. This is, if you pay attention, a repeated theme in Johns, the idea of spooning, right? Emotional intimacy connected to cutlery. And on this side of the painting, you will see, if you look very carefully, the words dead man. And in x-rays of the painting, we know there's actually a skull and crossbones underneath the heavily scumbled paint. But more to the point, the fork and the spoon, which bespoke their intimacy, is on this side of the painting separated. It's very hard to make out, but you will see that there is a fork and a spoon. I can barely reach the fork. It's on the far end of the painting right there. Some of you probably can see it directly above my finger there. And the fork and the spoon, right, speaking to the end of the relationship. And the overall iconography of the image, of course, is redolent of that American flag in reverse. So the picture that literally inaugurated their relationship, that flag painting, returns here to bid it adieu. But it wasn't so easy. What do you do if your entire career is premised on the idea that you have a partner who understands what you're going for and that your iconography, that your imagery is in partnership with that person? How then do you make art, right? So Johns worries about it in a series of pictures called Voice, in which, if you look very carefully, the fork and the spoon are separated. There's the fork, there's the spoon. Do you see them? Right? And they constitute a weight that pulls on a fulcrum that causes this eraser to come down and erase a word, and that word is voice. Here in another drawing, it's even more clearly, now it's just a fork, but you see very clearly, right, weighing down and wiping away the word voice. But Johns always found a way to encode and address sexuality. And in this, he's looking at his own tendency to ventriloquize. He even calls the painting, of course, ventriloquist. And in this instance, he's using in particular an iconography that is familiar to fans of American literature, because this is the frontispiece, or actually the background image is the frontispiece of the famous queer American novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville. That's the whale that features in the original frontispiece. Can you make out the flukes of the tail here and the open mouth of the sperm whale with its teeth? Do you see that? It's hard to see in the light, but trust me, it's there. And next to it, all these attributes of selfhood. For example, that's the typical two flags. And here is a version he did in green, orange, and black. Why? Because, of course, if you stare at that for a minute and then stare at a white piece of paper, they are the color wheel opposites and will reverse themselves into red, white, and blue. And so the picture becomes a meditation on our relationship to the artist, how he projects meaning through other things and through us. Even here, right, where you have a vase that is also, of course, a portrait of none other than Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, right? Is it a vase or is it a portrait? And a print at the top by Barnett Newman, known as Voice. And his own, Johns' own collection of George Orr pots. And so this open-mouthed whale becomes a way for Johns to address his sexuality through the vehicle of Herman Melville's text, because Melville creates the emblem Moby Dick, the dangerous white whale that's trying to kill everybody, as a kind, as we now know from much queer studies literature, as a kind of analog of his own homosexuality, right? They feel each other. Ahab knows where the whale knows where Ahab is. They are dead set as enemies, but they're also deeply intertwined. And, of course, the text itself is redolent of these queer meanings. Chapter 26, men's hands grasping hands in an orgy of sperm. They're talking about, of course, cutting open the whale and removing the spermaceti, the valuable stuff inside the whale's head, but Melville knew what he was doing. And, of course, the novel begins with Queequeg in bed, right, with another man. So you've got queerness all over that book, and the projection Melville makes of his homosexuality onto Moby Dick, and then, right, Johns' use of that symbol to address his own sexuality. And then remarkably, in the drawing that he produces for it, we see that whale much more clearly delineated, along with the George Orr pots, now right, two American flag paintings. But also, and importantly, look at the reserve space around that image. What do you see? The letter I, right? He's carefully placed the flags so that the entire, as it were, ground of the image is the letter I. And that idea that he's hiding in there is amplified by just a happenstance discovery, and I'm sorry that I have such a crappy slide of it. But one day, looking at the drawing, Painting for Two Flags from 1969, the year of the Stonewall Revolution, I turned over the Jasper Johns and to my amazement found the words, Painting for Two Fags. Johns does not make spelling mistakes. And that, of course, has been my point, that if we attend to the particulars of art history, we will not only get a fuller picture of the visual arts, but we will also get a fuller picture of a history of sexuality that by definition often couldn't appear in literary sources, but could nonetheless be represented. Thank you.